All right, deep divers, buckle up, because today we're going to take a deep dive into the very idea of cause and effect. And, it sounds simple at first, but we're going to explore some really, really tricky questions. Like, how do we actually know what causes what? Especially when things get messy and complicated in real life. Our guide for this deep dive is this paper. It's called Actual Causation and Nondeterministic Causal Models.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
I know, right? The title sounds a little bit, academic and jargony.
Yeah.
But trust me, this stuff is surprisingly relevant. It gets at the heart of how we understand the world, especially when things are not clear-cut.
Absolutely. It's really tempting to think that cause and effect is simple, right? Like A happens, then B happens, so obviously A caused B. But real life is rarely that straightforward. There are all these nuances and layers, especially when you have multiple things that could have caused something, or random chance events, or those what-if moments that make you think, what if things had gone differently?
It's like those sliding doors moments in the movies.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's where these non-deterministic structural causal models come into play, NSCMs.
NSCMs.
The paper uses them to acknowledge that in the real world, the same action, sometimes can lead to different outcomes. And that makes figuring out the actual cause a lot more challenging.
It really does. One way to think about it is this. Deterministic models, they're like a recipe. You put in the same ingredients every time, you get the same cake right every single time.
Right, predictable.
But these NSCMs, they're more like real life. You might do the same thing every day, but some days things go differently, and that's okay, that's normal. The paper actually uses this example about patients recovering from an illness. There are 2 treatments, and they both work, sometimes, but not always. And in one case, the doctor changes the treatment, and the patient, unfortunately, doesn't recover. But in another case, a different patient gets the standard treatment, and they also don't recover. But here's the thing. That second patient, they might have recovered if they had gotten that other treatment.
Okay, I see where this is going. So if you have a patient who gets one treatment and recovers, but they might have recovered anyway under a different treatment, how do we figure out what actually caused the recovery?
That is the million-dollar question. And that's where this idea of counterfactual dependence becomes so important.
Counterfactual dependence. Okay, I think I've heard that term before, but remind me.
It's all about exploring those what-if scenarios. If something hadn't happened, would something else still be the same? What if I hadn't had that extra cup of coffee? Would I still be this jittery?
Right.
The paper points out that this gets a little tricky with these non-deterministic models, with the fact that things aren't always predictable, because it's not about absolute certainty, it's about the possibility of things being different.
So it's not just about looking at what did happen, but thinking about what could have happened under different circumstances.
Exactly. And honestly, we all do this kind of counterfactual reasoning in our everyday lives all the time.
Oh, totally. Like, if I hadn't hit snooze this morning, I wouldn't be late for work. But let's be honest, I probably would have been late anyway.
Right. There's always traffic or something else. These NSCMs, they help us model that real-life messiness where things don't always go according to plan.
Do they count for all the what-ifs?
Exactly.
Okay, so we have these NSCMs to account for the fact that outcomes aren't always predictable. And we have this idea of counterfactual dependence that's helping us explore all those what-if possibilities. Where do we go from there? How do we actually pin down what actually caused something?
That's where the paper gets even more fascinating. It dives into this idea of structural simplifications.
Structural simplifications.
Yeah, and it's all about finding the true cause in a complex system.
Okay, so we're trying to map out all the different things that could have contributed to a certain outcome, but why would we want to simplify things? Wouldn't we lose important details that way?
That's a great question. Sometimes our initial model, like our first attempt at explaining things, it might be too complex. We might be thinking about too many things at once, and it can obscure the actual cause and effect relationships.
Okay, so it's like having too many ingredients in a recipe. You can't taste the individual flavors.
Yeah, exactly. By simplifying things, by focusing on just a few key ingredients at a time, we can see how they work together, how they truly impact the final dish. It's like removing a piece from a machine to see if the rest still works.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So going back to that patient recovery example, we might try to simplify things by saying, okay, what if we take out the effects of this particular medication? And if the patient still recovers, it suggests that maybe that medication wasn't really the key factor.
You got it. And that brings us to the paper's definition of actual causation.
Hit me with it.
Actual causation happens when counterfactual dependence, you know, those what-if scenarios, when they hold true, even when we simplified the model. It's like saying, yeah, this thing caused that thing, even though other stuff was happening that could have also caused it.
So it's not enough for it to be one possible cause. It has to be a cause that makes a difference, even when we're only looking at the most important connections.
You got it. It's about figuring out the key players, the things that really matter.
I'm with you.
And the paper gives this really cool example where this new definition of actual causation works much better than the old way of thinking about things. Imagine a doctor prescribes a medication, right? And usually this medication works really well. But in this specific case, the patient doesn't get any better.
So naturally, you start to wonder, did the medication cause this lack of improvement?
Exactly. Now, here's where things get tricky with those non-deterministic models, remember. Those models where outcomes aren't always predictable.
Yeah, because there's always a chance that other things could have led to the same outcome, even if the patient had gotten better with the medication.
Exactly. And the old way of thinking about actual causation would lead us to a really weird conclusion here. Just by adding in the possibility that the medication might not have worked anyway, we might end up saying that the doctor's decision to prescribe it, that was actually part of the cause of the patient not improving.
Wait, really? That's kind of counterintuitive. It's like saying that doing something that usually helps somehow caused it to not work in one specific case.
I know, it's weird, right? And that's where this new definition comes in and saves the day. It avoids all that weirdness by focusing on those what-if scenarios in the simplified models. It helps us figure out what truly matters without getting caught up in all the noise.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Oh,
So we're really rethinking how we understand cause and effect here. It's not just about observing what happened. It's about thinking about all the different possibilities and figuring out how different things contribute to an outcome in all those different situations.
you nailed it. And that's exactly what makes this paper so cool and so relevant.
Yeah, it really shows how important it is to consider those other scenarios, those other possibilities. Just because something could have caused something doesn't mean it actually did, right?
It's like, you know, those crime dramas where the detective's got to consider all the suspects, right?
Yeah.
Eliminate the red herrings. And then finally, they build a case for the most likely explanation.
Such a good analogy. And this paper gives us some really powerful tools for that kind of detective work, especially in those situations where, things aren't so clear-cut, where multiple things could have caused something, or there's an element of chance involved.
Right, right. So we've got these NSCMs that take into account the fact that outcomes aren't always predictable. And we've got this idea of counterfactual dependence to help us explore all the what-if possibilities. But the paper doesn't stop there, does it? It also delves into how we can actually discover those causal relationships in the first place, right? You're right, it does. It goes even deeper, suggesting a framework for how we actually do causal discovery. And one of the most important types of information we use, according to the author, are these things called interventionist statements of possibility.
Interventionist statements of possibility. Okay, that sounds intriguing, but I'm going to need a little help unpacking that one. What exactly are those?
Well, imagine you're a scientist and you're studying the effects of a new drug. You might do a clinical trial where you give the drug to some patients and a placebo to others.
Right, the classic control group.
Exactly. And then you carefully observe what happens in each group. But an interventionist statement of possibility wouldn't just say, oh, the drug cured everyone. It would say something more like, okay, it's possible for people to recover if they take this drug. You see the difference.
Right, because even with the same treatment, different things can happen to different people.
Right.
So we're not just recording what happened in the study, but considering all the things that could have happened, even if they didn't actually occur in this particular study.
Exactly. And by gathering enough of these interventionist statements of possibility, especially from different studies with different interventions, we can start to piece together the underlying causal structure. It's like, putting a puzzle together bit by bit.
Oh, I like that. Like each little experiment is a piece of the puzzle, and the more pieces we have, the clearer the picture becomes.
Exactly.
Okay, but it seems like we're kind of assuming we have perfect information here. In the real world, data can be messy, experiments aren't perfect, and there are always things we can't predict. So how do we account for that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the author actually acknowledges this too. The paper sets aside those more, statistical challenges and focuses more on the logical frameworks, like how should we be thinking about causation, even if things get messy in practice.
So it's like setting up a theoretical blueprint for how things should work in an ideal world, even if it's not always that neat and tidy in reality.
Exactly. It's like laying the foundation for how we reason about cause and effect, even when things get complicated.
Makes sense. But even in this ideal framework, I mean, the paper acknowledges that there are still limits to what we can actually learn from these interventionist statements of possibility. We can't always pinpoint the exact cause and effect relationship with absolute certainty, right?
That's right. Sometimes multiple models, multiple explanations could fit the same set of observations. So the paper introduces this idea of a default model.
Default model, is that kind of like our best guess based on what we know so far? Like our starting point, but we're open to changing our minds if we learn something new?
Exactly. And that process of changing our minds, of revising our model, it often involves thinking about those counterfactual possibilities again. Remember, it's not just about what did happen, but what could have happened.
Right, right. It's like we're always testing and refining our understanding, looking for those inconsistencies or surprises that might challenge our assumptions.
Yeah. We might see something happening, create a default model to explain it, and then bam, we find something new that doesn't quite fit. A counterfactual situation that makes us rethink the whole thing.
And that's where this whole idea of actual causation becomes super important again.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at correlations. We're trying to find those underlying connections, the things that make a real difference.
Exactly. It's like we're constantly searching for those fundamental forces, those causal connections that are shaping the outcomes we see in the world around us.
Right. So we're not just passively observing the world and taking things at face value. We're actively probing, testing, and refining our understanding through those interventions and those counterfactual thought experiments.
Precisely. And this paper gives us a really powerful framework for doing just that. It really highlights the importance of looking beyond those simple explanations. We have to think about the possibility of these backup causes and recognize that the chain of events that lead to something happening is usually much more complicated than we think at first glance.
Right, right. It's like those behind-the-scenes documentaries. We only see the final product, but there's this whole intricate process that went into making it happen.
Exactly. And this paper encourages us to look behind the curtain, ask those what if questions and really try to figure out which causes were truly essential versus those that were just kind of waiting in the wings just in case.
Okay, yeah. It's like we need to develop a more, I don't know, a more sophisticated awareness of the hidden complexities behind, all the things we see happening around us.
Absolutely. We have to move past these simple linear models of cause and effect and start to embrace a more nuanced perspective, one that recognizes the role of chance, the influence of multiple factors, and the difference between those necessary causes and those redundant ones.
This has been a super fascinating deep dive into, actual causation, right?
Mm.
We've explored these non-deterministic models. We've talked about counterfactual reasoning and all that. But before we wrap up, I'm curious, what are the practical implications of all this? How can we use these ideas to make better decisions in our lives, to understand the world around us more accurately, and just generally, navigate those tricky situations where cause and effect are just so intertwined?
That's a great question, and the author actually addresses this pretty directly. They suggest that this framework, this way of thinking about actual causation, it has implications for all sorts of things: law, medicine, artificial intelligence, even our personal lives.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Let's start with law, for example.
Hmm.
I can see how these concepts could be really important when it comes to determining responsibility, figuring out who's to blame for something.
Totally. Imagine a court case where someone's accused of negligence, right? The prosecutor might argue that the person's actions were the actual cause of some harm, even though other things could have contributed too.
And the defense might argue that, hey, there were all these other factors that could have led to the same outcome, even if their client hadn't been involved. So it becomes a question of were the defendant's actions truly necessary for the harm to occur?
Exactly. And this paper, this whole framework we've been talking about, it can really help us evaluate those arguments in a much more careful way. Did the person's actions really make a difference, or would those other factors have led to the same result anyway?
It's almost like we're doing those structural simplifications again, right? We're
Yeah.
trying to get rid of the extra noise, focus on the most important connections, and ask those what-if questions to figure out if the person's actions truly mattered.
You got it. And you can apply that same kind of thinking to all sorts of situations, not just in law, but like medical diagnoses or figuring out whether a government policy is actually working or not.
Yeah. In medicine, I can see how this could help doctors make better decisions about treatment, right? It's not just about knowing the potential risks and benefits, but also understanding that even when you do everything right, You can't always guarantee a positive outcome.
Absolutely. Every patient is unique, right? Bodies react to treatment in different ways, and there are always these possibilities of unforeseen consequences or interactions between different factors. This paper, with its emphasis on these non-deterministic models, it reminds us that we can't always be 100% sure how a treatment is going to affect a patient.
So it's really a call for more humility in medicine. We have to recognize the limits of what we know and be willing to change our approach based on each individual case. We have to be constantly thinking about those what-if scenarios, considering other possibilities, and being open to changing our course of action as we learn more, right?
Right. And these ideas, they also have huge implications for artificial intelligence. I mean, think about it. We're building these machines that can learn and make decisions, right? And we want them to be able to understand cause and effect, too. We need them to think about more than just simple correlations and patterns.
Right. If we want AI to be able to operate in the real world in a way that's safe and ethical, then they have to be able to tell the difference between a real causal connection and just something that happens to occur together by chance.
Yeah, yeah. They need to be able to think about those what-if scenarios and understand that the same action, it can lead to totally different outcomes depending on the situation. It's almost like we're trying to teach these machines to think like scientists, to be curious, to question their assumptions, and to always be looking for a better understanding of how things actually work.
It's really mind-blowing to think about how developing AI and our own understanding of causation, they're kind of intertwined. As we try to teach machines to reason about cause and effect, we might actually end up learning even more about how we think and how we make decisions.
It's true. It just goes to show that our understanding of cause and effect, it's always evolving. There's always something new to learn, some new connection to discover, and new ways to refine our thinking.
Well, I think we've finally reached the bottom of this deep dive into actual causation. We've explored these non-deterministic models, we've talked about the power of counterfactual reasoning, and we've discovered how all of this can help us understand the world better, and make more informed choices.
It's been a really amazing journey, and I hope everyone listening has come away with a new appreciation for how complex causation really is and a better understanding of the tools we can use to navigate that complexity.
This paper has given us so much to think about, right? It's shown us how to recognize the interplay of certainty and chance, how to use the power of counterfactual reasoning, and ultimately how to become better thinkers and decision makers. It's about moving beyond those black and white views of cause and effect and embracing those shades of gray.
So to everyone listening, keep asking those what-if questions, keep exploring those possibilities, and never stop searching for a deeper understanding of how the world works.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.